So we have just talked about what was wrong with psychology, and particularly behavioral psychology in the 60s and 70s. And obviously, there was really a lot wrong with it. So the question is, what would make a good Islamic psychology? And a good Islamic psychology, of course, has to recognize some of the things that were ignored by behavioral psychology in the past. We have to recognize that the human being is created by Allah. We have to realize that the human being has been given free will by Allah. We have to realize that the human being is not an animal, among a few things. And we need to, when we do a study or when we are working from an Islamic point of view, we do need to consider the fact that what we are doing here is about the perfection of the soul. So as an Islamic psychology, we have to also consider that we are going into the area of that is right outside of physical existence. And it needs to be a very religiously oriented type of psychology. And one of the things that we're going to have to do in books on what would be an ideal Islamic psychology, the suggestion is we combine the worldly with the spiritual. But I think that this is a wrong idea, that there's no such thing as combining the worldly with the spiritual, because there is really no such thing as the worldly. Secular materialism wants to have the world without God. The right way of life is a God-centered, spiritually oriented way of life, so that there is nothing that is not in the realm of God. So the idea of worldly as opposed to godly should not even apply in Islam. So we should not be considering how we can combine the worldly knowledge with the spiritual knowledge. We need to what we really need to be doing is seeing how we can combine the what has traditionally been considered spiritual knowledge with now what we know to be spiritual knowledge from the point of view of a better understanding of the nature of Allah and His creation. That there is no separation. It's not just we want to combine them. It's that we want to understand that there's not a separation between worldly knowledge and spiritual knowledge. And then we all know that Allah has told us that there is no illness for which there is not a cure, although we may not know what that cure is. And I think that it is really clear that this is not only referring to physical illness, that this is referring to psychological or social illness also. So when Allah tells us that there's no such thing as an illness with no cure, that this really gives us a perfect reason to believe we can come up with a Islamic psychology that can transform the world, and to expect that we have every right to look for those things, and they do exist, that will be that cure. And that we may already know enough to help bring about that cure. Whether or not we know enough yet for sure, I couldn't be positive, but I think we are getting close to that point. Maybe I can just say a little bit now about what the Khalifa method is in raising children, and then point out the psychological aspects of that. because what we are doing what we are doing as at a particular school and in our parenting programs, when we are telling parents what to do, we are calling it the Khalifah method. And one of the things that is considered to be necessary in an Islamic psychology is to have a clear religious aspect to it, to make use of the fact that we are Muslim, and to help that with our motivation to do what is right. I mean, one of the problems when you want to make any positive change with people is to get that person motivated to want to be part of that positive change. And for a Muslim, we have a built-in system. And I think that it is more than being a Muslim. I think it really concerns being Khalifah of Allah. That to be Khalifah of Allah is like a higher order of understanding of our relationship with Allah than to say we are Muslim. So we start out with Khalifah. And we define that to children as I won't use vicegerent, that we one, act in place of Allah. 2, carry out will of Allah. 3, use Allah's power not our own. And we need to get the children to understand the magnificent significance of this. That it is not like Allah has said, you know, I want you to be a dishwasher or something. I mean, he is saying here, I want you to be my Khalifa. And as his Khalifa, we see that for 14 billion years he has been carrying out a grand cosmic plan in the universe. Now he is saying to us, now you are at a point where it is my expectation upon you, and part of your progression, to by your free will continue to carry out my plan in the physical existence. Has to be absolutely the best job in the whole world. You know, I always feel that if they were to run an ad in a newspaper for Khalifah of Allah, I would be down there quick. You know, it's just such a totally unbelievably wonderful job. And I know some people have said they feel a little uncomfortable with this language, which I believe I might have used yesterday. And I think it is fair to use this language, that in making us his Khalifa, actually Allah shares with us a little bit of the knowledge of what it is to be God. Of course, we are not God, right? And it is a tiny, tiny amount. But in that Allah says He created us to know Him. There is no better way than to really know somebody than to be in their position. So He actually puts us in His position by His choice. And then says, now I have some expectations upon you. So this should be a really big motivator, and we need a really big motivator in Islam. So instead of having a secular philosophy behind our psychology that leaves out God and leaves out free will and all these things, we put right at the center of our Islamic psychology, the concept of Khalifa as a motivating force to show that we have free will and to show specifically what Allah wants from us. Then we have 3 responsibilities. One, make self good. 2, help others become good. 3, make physical world good. So, the way to, in Islam, the scholars have said that the way to become anything you want to be, if you want to become something good, you see yourself as being someone who is that good thing, or is at least becoming that good thing. Because everything that we are going to become, we have to think about, and this is where our inner speech comes in. With an animal doesn't plan to be good or not good. An animal just does what it does. But a human being, we have to make some choices, and Allah says He wants us to make ourselves good. To be someone who makes yourself good, you have to have a lot of thoughts about making yourself good. So you have to be using your inner speech over and over again to be saying, I am someone who is making myself good. And after we see ourselves as becoming someone who is making ourselves good, we want to give lots and lots of reward or have lots and lots of satisfaction that we are somebody who is making ourselves good. Because any behavior, whether it is a physical behavior, verbal behavior, or even a thought that is followed by reward tends to increase in rate and magnitude in the future. And then, in a way, I was being asked a question earlier before you came today about a problem that has arisen at the school where we have our Khalifah program. And quite a bad thing happened. And it happened between kids. I don't want to say what it was, but so they are getting teachers involved in talking to the child to get him to not want to do such a thing again, and they're getting his parents to talk to him to get him to not want to do such a thing again. But what I suggested is that what they really need to do, along with the parents and the teachers, is they need to have a group of the older influential boys in the school and the head prefects who tend to be quite large also. Not because they want to go scare him, but because if half a dozen of his peers who he has to respect, and the head prefects are relatively well respected at the school, and they are some really quite, some of them are quite advanced spiritually. If half a dozen people like this, who are your peers, come to see you and say, what you did is really unacceptable. We can just not have this kind of thing going on. You did that somehow or other because you thought it was cool or you thought it was okay. We want to let you know we don't think it is cool and we don't think it is okay. And ultimately, you cannot even stay here with us if you are somebody who continues to think that is cool and okay. That you do have to think in a right Islamic manner to exist within the Ummah. I mean, it has been traditionally the practice within the Islamic Ummah that certainly if somebody has a bad behavior, we try and help them get over that bad behavior. And there are techniques, and you know, I talk about shaping all the time, and Al-Ghazali has some processes that are really clearly the shaping process to help get rid of some negative behaviors. But occasionally you come across somebody who just refuses to change. And I know this sounds very harsh, but ultimately, as an ummah, we don't want to hurt the people or you know, physically harm them. But one of the things that is like the last sanction is to banish them from the opportunity to associate with other Muslims. Because the thing that we absolutely cannot allow in our ummah is for people to go around feeling it is okay to be a bad influence. So, and you notice I say we cannot have people going around feeling it is okay to be a bad influence. I'm not talking about the behavior of being a bad influence even. We cannot have people that feel that that is okay. Because if you feel it is okay, you are likely to do it. And in Islam, Allah has told us that always the thought will precede the action. And this is why it is very, very critical in an Islamic psychology to deal with the thought processes. Basically, a Muslim should think in a right manner. And Islam has been set up to create a society of people who do think in a right manner. And if you get people who want to fight against that and are not willing to think in a right manner, ultimately it is better that they be banished from association with other Muslims than they be allowed to stay and harm the ummah. I know it is a very harsh thing, banishment, but and people will feel very sad. But the reality is that Allah has asked us to live our lives in a certain way and to speak words in a certain way and even to think thoughts in a certain way. And if you step too far out of that, you start becoming a model for wrong behavior among other Muslims. And this is that in Islam we can afford an occasional person who does wrong. But what we cannot afford to have within our ummah is an influence on others to do wrong. And so if a person like, say for instance, this boy I'm talking about, if it ended up that he just said, look, I just don't care, I'm going to do anything I want to do, then the school would have to banish him from having association with the other students. Because we cannot have people putting those ideas in. This is a social influence. And Islam is designed to have individuals and a society that are constantly writing positive influences. This is the whole purpose really of what I think is Islamic psychology. That in Islamic psychology, yes, we can understand the influences of what goes into your consciousness through the three influences from the environment, that they happen on the basis of the laws of learning. But ultimately, what we want to do is have thoughts going on in the mind of every Muslim that are consistent with the thoughts that Allah would want us to have. And anything other than that is not acceptable. So, and as an Islamic psychology, what we then will try and do is teach children techniques to achieve that. So we say, this is your role. It is a really wonderful role. It is the most wonderful role in the world. And these are your three responsibilities. But if you don't do anything with them, it doesn't matter whether you're a Khalifah of Allah or not. It doesn't matter if these are your responsibilities. They only matter if you are someone who is actually doing them. And to be someone who is actually doing them, you have to think of yourself as someone who is Khalifah of Allah, who has these responsibilities and who wants to carry them out. The the way to carry out these three responsibilities is through jihad. And jihad does not mean holy war. Right? Holy war is a Christian concept from the Crusades. It has never been an Islamic concept. In Islam, we occasionally consider war necessary, but we do not consider war holy. And if at all possible, we will try and avoid war. What jihad means is struggle. But it is a particular kind of struggle. It is not just any struggle. It is really, it is the holy struggle. So I think it is nice because, you see, because human beings think in symbolic language, in an Islamic psychology, we want to give them a language to think in that is going to shape their thoughts in a right direction. And so if we define jihad as holy war, we will have people thinking that it is my goal to get a gun or a bomb and go out and blow somebody up or shoot somebody. But if we consider jihad to be the holy struggle, which is the struggle of good against evil, because that's exactly what it is. And we want children to learn to think in their minds that as Khalifah of Allah, I am involved constantly in jihad, constantly in struggle of good against evil. And if they don't have the thoughts, they won't have the behavior. Then how do you carry out the struggle of good against evil? Command the right, forbid the wrong. So we want to, this is why I was saying to the teacher who came to talk to me today about what they should do with this problem that came up in the school. And what I said to her is, we want the teachers to talk to the child and command the right and forbid the wrong. We want the parents to talk to the child and command the right and forbid the wrong. But very importantly, we want the child's peers to talk to him and command the right and forbid the wrong, so that he will see that in all the different aspects of his environment, he is getting feedback to say what he did was really unacceptable. And not only what he did was unacceptable, but to think that it was okay to do was unacceptable. You see, because in Islam, our goal is not to have right-acting people, our goal is to have right-thinking people. This is why an Islamic psychology, I think, is very much needed. Psychology that deals with the fact that we are not animals, we are human beings, that we are the creation of Allah, and that we have a particular role to do. And we need to think about this role all the time. And the more you think about something, the more you are likely to do it. Unfortunately, this is why we want to keep bad ideas out of the minds of the children, because if you think about bad things, also, you are more likely to do the bad things. And this commanding the right and forbidding the wrong, it is not only something that we do to others, but it is the thing we are constantly supposed to be doing to ourselves with our inner speech. We are constantly to be making assessments of the impact of the physical and of the social environment, which are external, and even of our inner speech. And when they write a message in here, it is the responsibility of a Muslim to be saying, is this a message that was written in here that Allah would want written in here? I am Allah's Khalifah. Is this a message that Allah wants written in the mind of His Khalifah? If it is, we then use our inner speech to enhance the effect of this. As I may have shown before, we then say some things to tell us that this positive message that has been written in there is a good thing, something that Allah wants, something that is good for the Ummah, something that is good for you as a Muslim individual. The more things you can say with your inner speech to support any message that is written in here that is a message that is what Allah wants to be, you then make yourself a better Muslim. But of course, if you have a bad message written in here, and with the social environment, people give you some reward for believing in and carrying out the actions of this bad message, and you are thinking thoughts about this, then of course Shaitan uses this method also. So in Islamic psychology, we want to have a very good understanding on the behalf of the children, well, for every Muslim, but particularly when we're raising children, we want them to have a very good understanding of what is really right and what is really wrong. That there are two classes of behavior. There is the class of behavior that Allah says is okay, and there is the class of behavior that Allah says is not okay. And there's not a third class which Allah doesn't care about. It is either okay or it is not okay. And we need to actually think of ourselves as people, as Muslims, who dearly love what Allah loves and have a total disdain approaching hatred of everything that is wrong. I don't really want to use the word hatred, because if we start hating the things of Shaitan and we see them in somebody, we can go over the bounds from hating the thing to hating the person. And in Islam, we don't want to do that. Even people who do very wrong things in Islam, we don't want to hate them as a person, right? We want to make it really clear we hate the things they are doing. The things are really unacceptable. So the whole process of Islamic psychology seems to be bound up in how we exactly communicate within ourselves through our inner speech and with others. Because as we are commanding the right and forbidding the wrong, which we can do with our inner speech for ourselves and with our actual words for others, we don't just do this any way at all. There is a very specific way to do this. And by the way, this is assuming high taqwa. And why it is assuming high taqwa? Because high taqwa is not fear of Allah, but it is being in one with the desires of Allah and knowing perfectly, having such a intimate and close and caring and warm and loving relationship with Allah that there is no difference in your mind about what you want and what things you think about and what Allah would want you to think about. So if you're going to go around commanding the right and forbidding the wrong, you can't do so successfully unless you have high taqwa, unless you have really come to understand right and wrong. Then when we go about commanding the right and forbidding the wrong, the way to do it is with beautiful words and wisdom. And of course, beautiful words are the words people like to hear. In other words, people like to hear us be kind to them. People like us to praise them. People like us to notice their good qualities. People like us to smile at them. People like us to, in many ways, say to them, we like you, and what you are doing is good. And in Islam, there is supposed to be a lot of this going on. But we don't want the children to be thinking that all of this praise is for them. Right? All of this praise ultimately needs to be passed on by them immediately to Allah. That if they do something good and somebody praises them, they should not be thinking, oh, I am so wonderful, I got this praise. They should be thinking, oh, Allah is so wonderful, He allowed me to do a thing that was praiseworthy, and He is the one really deserving of the praise. But the praise came to me through Him. So we don't get children who go around thinking it is them who are wonderful. That it is Allah who makes them wonderful. And the beautiful words and wisdom, the wisdom is a very critical part. The wisdom is really basically about the laws of learning. That you say nice words to people, or smiles, or whatever, or give people whatever they like. Essentially, beautiful words could mean, in the technical language of operant learning theory, could mean reinforcement. But you give that reinforcement wisely. You don't give that reinforcement unwisely. And I gave the example before of the grandfather who had the grandson, and he kept smiling and nodding yes every time his grandson would kick the little cat. And from the little boy's point of view, his grandfather's giving him beautiful words, but from anybody's point of view, he is not doing it wisely. And so part of the responsibility of Islamic psychology, whether it is done by a psychologist or a parent or a teacher in influencing children, is to know how to interact with them and what kind of things to say and when to say those things and when to give feedback that will direct the child toward the fulfillment of their role as Khalifah of Allah. Then one of the things that is very critical to right Islamic thought, right? And I mean, in a way, the whole purpose of being Muslim and being Khalifah of Allah, and the purpose of Islam as a way of life that Allah has given us, is so that we have minds full of right thoughts. Because a mind that is full of right thoughts is not going to exhibit wrong behaviors. I mean, you cannot get wrong behaviors from a mind that is full of right thoughts. So, how do we get to the right thoughts? What we want the children to do and learn to do as Khalifah of Allah and here we get to the part that I say is what has been missing in Islam, and we need to bring back in that Allah, I've said it 4 or 5 times, but you could hear it 100 times because it's so important, that Allah has told us He gave us 2 Quran, the physical book of spiritual belief and practice that He gave to our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and He set up a whole great, grand, magnificent, huge universe for us to learn all sorts of things from Him. And this word contemplate, actually, Eastern religions such as the Hindu religions and Buddhism, they talk a lot about contemplation. But when they are talking about contemplation, they are really talking about trying to make a psychic break with the physical world around you and separating yourself from that and only and contemplating the non-physical world. And that is not contemplation in Islam. In Islam, because we are a very practical religion, contemplation in Islam is to have actual, it really means deep thinking about a subject. Not trying to break away from the material world. The material world is Allah's creation. So we are to think very, very deeply about Allah's creation. And this is what Allah has told us over and over again. We have been told this because Allah has told us, I think, 30 times in the Quran how important it is for us to look around the universe and learn the knowledge that He has set out for us. And I think 33 times in the Quran, Allah has told us how severe will be the consequences if we don't do that. And we live in an ummah today, in a world today, that our ummah is suffering terrible, terrible consequences. And we are suffering terrible consequences even in places where people read the Quran every day, pray, and fast, and pay their zakat, and are really dedicated to remembrance of Allah. But they are not dedicated to the contemplation of Allah's creation. So they are looking with great emphasis on one of the two books, which is wonderful. I mean, I'm not saying reduce that. I'm saying we want to equally look at the objective information of Allah's creation. And when we know that objective information about Allah's creation, it energizes something within us, like our spiritual nature. And we say, this is just so wonderful, I can't believe it. And this contemplation can be such as, like when I am talking about the basic physical structure of the universe. You could say, as most people do, and they don't know much more than this, they say, okay, Allah created the physical world. But how exactly do you contemplate in a deep way Allah's creation of the physical world unless you know how Allah created the physical world? You can't just keep saying to yourself, Allah created the physical world, Allah created the physical world. This is not deep contemplation. And to just say that without realizing the magnificence that went behind Allah's creation, then you lose the effect of it. But if you are to visualize, even to the degree that I have been correct in presenting the way Allah created His physical world, that Allah took this created light and at a point with no dimension at all, He brought this light together in such a way that it created these three amazing particles of which everything around us is made up of. Then we can start contemplating these particles. We can contemplate that we are these particles, our friends are these particles, our books are these particles, our computer are these particles, the sun is these particles. Everywhere we go are these particles. And these particles have a nature. That nature is to do what Allah wants them to do. And Allah is constantly telling them what to do through sending them information through bits of light from outside of space and time to direct their behavior correctly according to His will. Now, without going into more detail than that, we are getting to a point where this is what we are talking about teaching the children to contemplate the creation of Allah. When you are contemplating creation at that level, it is very hard to not get caught up in the magnificence of what Allah has done. And then you say, and Allah made enough protons, neutrons, and electrons to make up 10,000 billion stars that we can see here. and so many of them more in other places, and maybe an unlimited number of dimensions where this is happening, and that over the whole universe, Allah's grand cosmic plan is for every bit of this matter to be grouping into more and more complex groupings, so that they can manifest more and more completely the attributes that had been imbued into matter through the created light of Allah. Now, if you are contemplating things like that, you are contemplating things at such a high level that they have a very deep impact on your consciousness. A much deeper impact on your consciousness than merely saying Allah created the physical world. Because when you leave the detail out, you are not really contemplating. You are just making a statement. But when you contemplate and look at what Allah is really doing, and then when you start doing that, not just with the creation of the universe, but in everything that you do, because ultimately this is the point that we want to achieve. We want to be putting our minds toward the contemplation of Allah's creation in everything that we do, so that every moment we are actually putting more and more information in here that is good information. And as I pointed out before, if you have a consciousness, these are G's, not sixes, that is just full of all sorts of good information, and that you have contemplated Allah's creation to the degree that you understand the magnificence of it, that you have contemplated your relationship with Allah as His Khalifa, so that it is like the most magnificent thing that could possibly happen to you. And when you look at your responsibilities that Allah has given you to make yourself good and to help others be good and make the physical world be good, and these are the thoughts that are going on in your consciousness all the time, and you are constantly reinforcing these thoughts with beautiful words and wisdom yourself, with your inner speech, that you have a constantly progressing consciousness, towards more and more a fully and truly Islamic consciousness. And this is what we want to teach children to do. It is not, so people, when they first hear about the simple level of the Khalifa method, which sounds like just basically tell the children they are Khalifa of Allah, say nice things to them after they do something good, and remind them in a nice way when they do something bad. That is plenty to have some success, but it is only barely a tiny starting point in where we want to go. We want to take the children to the point where they are in constant contemplation of the creation of Allah. And once you are in constant contemplation of the creation of Allah, you have constant remembrance of Allah. And if you have constant remembrance of Allah and a consciousness filled with good ideas, it is virtually impossible to be anything but a good Muslim. Nothing else has any meaning. There is no place in your consciousness. If all of those goods in there, somebody were to try and write a bad message, it would stand out so significantly that you almost couldn't bear to have it. And what it is suggested that we do by the early scholars is if you are in a position where you know that you have had a bad message written in your consciousness, that you immediately isolate that. And don't let it, be sure you don't let it go further. You see, if first we just perceive something, this is the first stage, we perceive it. So we'll talk about clothes and Christina Aguilera again. You watch on MTV, right, and you're a teenage girl and you put on MTV and you see Christina Aguilera. Now that is just a perception. The first thing that gets written in your consciousness is the perception. If you can stop it at the level of it just being merely a perception, I have seen her. I haven't even had a thought about whether it's good or bad or anything. All I have done is seen her. Stop it at that point, really, really easy. But if she doesn't stop it at that point, and she goes ahead and thinks, wow, she looks so cool, and she's one of the most famous singers in the world, and she's making millions of dollars, and I see girls every day starting to dress that way. How come I'm dressing in a conservative Islamic manner? Why shouldn't I dress that way too? Then she has taken her perception to a new level, and it's a level of instead of contemplating the will of Allah, it's the contemplation of something that is opposed to the will of Allah. So she has taken a perception to now become an idea that she is thinking about. And then if she is saying to herself, and she says, oh, look, you know, I talked with some of my friends, and they feel the same way that I do, and I think this really has to be right. So now she started with a perception, she had a thought about it, now she has confirmed that her wrong thinking about the perception is right thinking. And then she says, well, you know, I'll go over to my friend's house and I'm going to dress in this way like Christina Aguilera, because my parents wouldn't let me out of the house that way. So I'll do it that way. And then she goes and dresses in this very rude manner and goes out and feels good about it. So then she has added another level to the reward of this. She's had the perception, she's had the thought, she's developed the thought, she's ended up with the behavior. And now that she has actually done the behavior, the next step is to make the behavior into a constant behavior or a habit. And at each one of these levels, it gets harder and harder to break in. So Islamic psychology is about teaching children to where to break in on this process. When I was talking, we had a qiyam with teenage girls from the Adni school and some other teenage girls last night. And one of the things we were talking about is the fact that, about the shaping process. And we were talking about what are right relationships between boys and girls, because, you know, although these girls are still in school, I mean, when you look at them, some of them look just like young women. And I'm sure some of the boys look at them just like they're young women. So we were saying, in a shaping process, that because it is very critical in Islam for the strength of the family, that people, both men and women, preserve their modesty and keep their relationship with the opposite sex essentially to nothing until you marry. That this is the ideal way that Allah has set up for us. But in the way that the world is today, and they are going to schools and there are boys and girls in the same classroom, that maybe you walk in the classroom and some boy that you think is cute in the classroom, he smiles. He smiles at you, right? Now, you can, with your inner speech, you can decide what to do. And maybe you smile back. So he sees, oh, well, this girl that I like, I smiled at her, she smiled back. Tomorrow, I talk to her. Talk friendly. And after they have talked friendly in class, maybe because there's some free time in school, they end up being in the hallway together and they end up just walking around as a couple. And maybe because now they are walking around as a couple at school, they decide, well, you know, maybe I'll tell my parents I'm going here, and the other one will tell my parents I'm going there, and we'll go down to KLCC and sit along the the benches around the lake and sit close together and maybe hold hands. And then maybe later you're in some place that's not so public, and one of the two gets the idea that maybe since all of this has happened, it might be nice to kiss. And the last step here, I refer to as better not to say. But this would not be an unlikely scenario for the way things could go among boys and girls, Muslim boys and girls even, in the world today, even in a relatively nice Islamic country like Malaysia. So what Allah has done is He has already told us where we are supposed to break into this process. Because if you want to break into this process here, it's going to be very difficult to do. You have already had all of the perceptions and the behaviors and the thoughts around these other various levels through your inner speech and through your rewards from the social influence. They've written message after message in here, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of messages, that by the time they're having a kiss, the messages are so deeply ingrained in there, it's really hard to stop at that point and then just say, no, I'm going way back. So where does Allah tell you to break into this process? It tells you to break in right here. You walk into the classroom and the boy smiles at you, and you just totally ignore him and go and sit down and do your work. Which will probably not lead to this, or to this, or to this, or to this, because you have made a decision with your inner speech to break into the shaping process at a very early stage. And you break into this shaping process with your thought processes, and you are saying to yourself, I am someone who is not going to smile at the boys. By the way, I did ask, not for a show of hands, but I did ask whether, because there was about 30 or 40 girls here, I said, don't tell me who you are, but you know, I'm sure you know each other fairly well. Are there any girls in here who might be considered that they sometimes flirt with boys? And you know, there was a whole lot of giggling and looking at certain people, and we know that it is happening, right? And of course, the way Allah has made human beings, these things are fun for them. But they are fun for them at an expense. So they need to, with their inner speech and with the messages they write in their consciousness, they have to say, yes, these things would be fun, but I am just not going to participate in them. So the whole purpose of all of this Islamic practice is to get the right messages written into the consciousness and to teach the children to make observations about both the shaping process and break in early, because it's easy to break in early and it's hard to break in late. To be careful about the messages that get written in the consciousness, and as soon as you see a bad message being written in, you isolate it and overwrite it so that it doesn't have an impact on you. And you give great care to your relationship with Allah as His Khalifah, and you say that I am somebody who takes this very seriously. And by actually saying it to yourself in your mind that I am someone who takes this very seriously, you become someone who takes it very seriously. You know, what we think is what we become. It isn't only what we do, it is what we become. So we go through this whole process, and all of it is really a psychological process. We are teaching the children to understand the psychology of their development, the psychology of how to use their inner speech, the psychology of how behaviors develop through a series of small steps through shaping. We talk about the right ways of communication and wrong ways of communication, the beautiful words and wisdom. We talk about looking at what is right and wrong and making determinations and saying those determinations to yourself and saying, no, I am someone who would not do this wrong thing, so that they are constantly writing messages in their consciousness with their thoughts, and as much as possible learning about the information from the Quran, which is the universe that Allah has created for us, to learn as much as possible, so when we, by understanding that magnificence, we see how important this whole thing we are caught up in is. And when we put all of that together, we end up with someone who is a very emotionally sound Muslim, who knows the techniques of staying away from what is wrong and increasing their influence and desire to move toward everything that is good and right, and to act in that same way with others. And this is what I would say is a right Islamic psychology that counters all of, in the first part, I talked about all the things that were wrong about psychology. And they were really wrong. They were not right things at all. So we throw all of that out, and we do everything that is right in Islam. And we make a psychology out of that, because we have a very definite set of rules. And I would say, because today's talk is called Islamic Psychology, a New Paradigm, this is just not the way we basically talk with kids. This is not what we have been teaching kids. We have been using, basically, Muslim psychologists have just been using the techniques of the West, not developing a psychology that is really based on exactly what a right Muslim should be. So here we develop a psychology on everything that a right Muslim should be. And the scholars and interpreters, Quran and Sunnah along the way, have shown us that these are the ways to be. And we know that this is how our beloved Prophet Muhammad acted with children. We have dozens of instances of his communication with children that were along these same kind of lines. Now, he didn't have to know, he didn't have to be able to describe the learning-based personality theory and the three sources of the environment. He just knew how to act rightly. But now, when we have a knowledge-based world, which is based on lots of objective knowledge, we want to give the kids all of this knowledge so that they can understand the position they are in as a Muslim in a world that is going to have all sorts of influences upon them, and to understand how much control they can have over those influences, and to be motivated by their contemplation of the creation of Allah and its magnificence and the magnificence of their role as Khalifah of Allah, to really go ahead and carry these things out. So that is basically what I propose as a very simplistic view, but a fairly complete, although simplistic view of an Islamic psychology. Yes?
How do you reckon in terms of the influences, the physical, social, and industry, in terms of percentile? Approximately, I mean, we have not done any research yet, but based on the past experience, how do you see the physical influence, the social influence in the industry?
Well, because Allah has made the world virtually perfect for us, that physical, as far as a worry, may be 5%. And the only thing about the physical world that is not good for us is ways that really human beings have changed it. If we hadn't changed the physical world, we would have very few bad influences. Social, maybe it could be more, you see, if you don't use your inner speech to counter it. But the whole key for being Khalifah of Allah, for being human instead of animal, for having free will, is here in our inner speech. And Allah has given us the power with our inner speech to become anything we want to become. I had made the point before that whoever is the best, because I was talking to girls last night, whoever is the best women's tennis player in the world right now, that she was not born to be the best women's tennis player in the world. She went through certain experiences and thoughts and saw herself as becoming this in a certain way. But if we looked at all of the women in the whole world, and if every one of them went through the experiences it took to become a world-class tennis player, there might be 1 million women in the whole world who could excel beyond where she has excelled to. And this potential that is within us needs to be unlocked, because Allah wants us to express our potential as Muslims in its fullest. And so we unlock that with our inner speech. Basically, I say to the kids, anything you want that is achievable, you can have, if you are willing to have the thoughts and do the behaviors to get it.
What about your total past learning history? I mean, in some of your career diagram, the position of fitra and so, can you just explain? Because quite a number of them are new to that.
Well, yes, we come into the world, we have a pure soul. And that soul comes into the world in a state of fitra, or perfect Islamic purity. But when it drops down into the world and has to make its way back, the idea is to create a purity in here that is equal that gets back to that fitra here. And the soul does not directly interact with the physical world here. It interacts through mind. And the mind interacts. This is really like the physical brain in here. All of these things are going on in the physical brain. They are mediated by the mind in relationship to the soul, because the soul cannot do it directly. So that is basically what I see the relationship being.
Is the soul part of the inner speech?
Is the soul part of the inner speech? Inner speech, I want to make clear, is not only our words to each other, right? It is our words, our feelings, our thoughts, and to the degree we have spiritual experiences, it is the impact of the spiritual experience. If you have a spiritual experience such as an inspiration, it has to come in through your inner speech, because if it is not perceived, it will never get in here. And there's no other way for it to get in there other than to be perceived really in the mind here as a message from the soul. And I think we're getting lots of messages from the soul. And part of what I'm really talking about this contemplation of Allah's creation is to create a brain which is connected to the mind in such a way that it can have communication with the soul in its pure sense, rather than to just be totally separate from it. But the whole goal is to make a oneness of the right consciousness here in the brain and in the mind that is equivalent to the fitra that is in the soul. This would be our goal, to create in this physical existence a state of fitra, of mind and brain.
Constantly fight
Pardon?
And to constantly fight in our nafsu, because the soul really gravitates. We put in our mind everything that's good, but we're also given nafsu, the one that our free will. So how do we counteract that?
How do you counteract it? You counteract it with your inner speech. That's why Allah gave us inner speech. Sure, we have all sorts of desires through our nafs, but we don't act on them. the only way we cannot act on them is by deciding not to through our inner speech. Basically, we will have the desires of the nafs, and with their inner speech we'll either say yes I will or no I won't. So that is where our free will comes in, to be either right or to be wrong.
How does Shaitan come into play in this?
Well, Shaitan wants can't use the physical world very much because it's already okay, and certainly very heavily uses the social influences, so that we live in a world that there are just constant social influences going on, trying to write bad messages in here. Every bad message, as a matter of fact, I mentioned this to the girls last night, every single bad message that is left in here was put in there by Shaitan. It was put there by Shaitan, but it is their inner speech that has decided to allow it to stay. So we can't stop Shaitan from putting in bad messages, from sending bad messages through the social environment to our perception, to getting written in here. And the way that the consciousness is made, you cannot even eliminate a bad message once it has been written in there. But what you can do is you can isolate it and write over it and say, I'm putting this out of the range that will have an effect on me. Yes?
What is the difference between contemplation and reflection? Is there a difference?
I'm only using the word contemplation because in English we don't really have a word to describe this deep level of thought. So by the word contemplation, you could take it as me saying in English, very deep level of thought. And to whether or not in English that is different than reflection, you can reflect on something at a fairly superficial level or a deep level. But if you contemplate, you can really only contemplate at a deep level. This is talking about contemplation at a very deep level.
I think your time is up.
Yeah.
Give you a release.
Yeah, I know.